Hi, in this video we're going to go over the build of the latest Eggtimer Quantum flight computer. If you look on my channel, you'll see that there was an older version that we did a build on. And in the meantime, the Quantum has been updated with some components that make it a little bit flatter, a little bit easier to build. But the functionality of the computer is exactly the same. It's still my go-to dual deploy, fully programmable flight computer. All the channels are programmable. It's got Wi-Fi. It is super easy to use out in the field, and very, very reliable. So, excellent flight computer, just a little bit updated with some new components. So we'll go over the new build because there are a few changes. This is my setup. It's a Hakko FX 972 soldering station. For this build, this is a pretty, fairly complicated build. I would highly recommend a decent soldering station for this build. The kind of cheap stick ones you get may be a little bit rough, tough to use for this build. But make sure you've got a good fume extractor, and I like to use a vise, and I set my temperature at about 700 degrees Fahrenheit with this soldering station. I use a 0.3 millimeter tip for most of the build. So we're going to open up the packages here and lay everything out on our work surface and do a physical inventory. This build, doesn't have quite as many components as, say, a proton or a quasar, but there's quite a few components in this package. So lay them all out. We'll physically check them off the list. Mainly, you do want to make sure you have all your components, but also this is the right time before you start soldering things to identify each component and know exactly what each one looks like, so you don't put one in the wrong place or inadvertently put it in the wrong position. So before I start the build, I like to cut out that Wi-Fi password code that's written on the front. Put that to the side. You're going to need that later. I like to keep that right in the package afterwards when I finish the build. So make sure you have that available. All right, so lay everything out neatly on your work surface, and then we'll start inventorying each component here. So once again, we're going to be doing this new Rev, the Rev B3. That's the version that we're going to be doing here. Current as of February and January 25, 2025. So here's the PCB. This is what you're going to be soldering all the components onto. Put that to the side and check that off on your list. Next up, we've got the Wi-Fi module. These are pretty standard across all of the Eggtimer builds. You should be able to recognize these. They're very distinctive. After the Wi-Fi, we've got an EEPROM. This is basically the processor chip that's going to run the board for you. It's an 8-pin chip. Okay, after that, we've got the voltage regulator. Once again, another pretty distinctive component used in virtually all of the Eggtimer builds. All right, and then we have a couple driver chips. They're 8 pins each, and you should have 2 of them. They look a lot like the processor chip, though, so don't mix them up. All right, we've got a 3-pin MOSFET, 3 solid big pins on the bottom, and then a kind of a metal on backing to it. And this large rectifier, it's got 2 small pins and a very large pin. Kind of looks like the voltage regulator, but much larger, and only has a couple pins on the small pins on the side. And then this little component is another MOSFET. And then you've got a standard buzzer. It is polarized. You've got, you can see there that plus sign is the positive side. We'll point that out again during the build when we go to put it on the board. Now the resistors. First up, you've got some 1K resistors. These are marked 102. You get 2 of these, you're only going to need 1. You get an extra for all of the resistors, which is nice in case you drop one on the floor. They're very hard to find. Next up, you've got these 4.7K resistors. They're marked 472. You're going to need 3 of these, and you get 4. For your 10Ks, these are marked 103, and you need 4 of these, and you get 5. Your 22K resistors, they're marked 223. You get 2 of these, and you're going to need 1. And finally, for the resistors, these are your 100K resistors. They're marked 104. You need 2 of these, and you get 3. Now, the capacitors are coming up, and these you have to pay attention to. These are your 0.1 UF capacitors. These are what's called the white carrier. You'll see the instructions refer to a white paper carrier. That's what this means. You get 4 of these, and you're going to need 3. So you do get 1 extra, but they look exactly like the 10 UF, which will be coming up next. So don't mess these up, because if you do, the board won't work. So when you compare and contrast these next ones, these are the 10 UF, and they're in a clear plastic carrier. So that's the one way you can tell the difference. Now you only get 2 of these. There is no extra, so be very careful. Don't drop these on the floor. If you do, especially if you have a rug, very difficult to find them. Okay, with the capacitors done, you get these pinned resistors. You're not going to use these for the build in terms of the resistors themselves. You just need the wires off them to wire in the Wi-Fi module. You get an angle header. We're going to be splitting this up and putting it on the board for your cabling. And finally, you get a terminal block to attach all of your deployment wiring to. And the kit comes with some soldering wire. It's really good Kester, no clean soldering wire. So highly recommend you use this unless you have something very similar. This is excellent soldering wire. I won't be using that particular soldering wire on my build. I have a roll of my own Kester that I use on my station. Okay, as noted, we're going to do the Rev B3, current as of Feb 2025. Noted earlier, I do use a pan device. I highly recommend something like this. It's a lot better than taping your board to the surface, because you can move it around. And then a couple pair of tweezers, a flat pair and a pointy pair. Very helpful in these builds. Okay, the first chip that we're going to put on the board is the EEPROM chip. It goes right there on that silk screened area. Now notice it's got a dot. That dot has to line up with the smaller silk screen square inside the larger rectangle. That's pin 1, and that's the orientation of the processor. If you get it wrong, the board won't work. So make sure you're orienting the chip correctly. But to put this in, you just tin one pad in one of the corners, and then slide the processor chip into place, and making sure that all 8 pins are centered in all directions on those thin pads. As you can see, it can be tough. You have to make sure that the solder's still hot to kind of grab one of those pins. And if it's wrong, once again, it's a little misaligned right there, it's okay. Just keep heating up the pad and moving the chip into place until it's centered like you like it. Once it's centered, go ahead and solder each pin one at a time. Now these pins, what you should be getting at the end is you should heat up each pin, solder so that a little bit of solder gets under each pin and connects to the pad. And you also end up with a nice, neat tent of solder, shiny tent of solder, which means you don't have a cold solder over the pin. It shouldn't be so much that you go all the way up and hit the chip, and it shouldn't bridge either under the chip or in between the pins themselves. So at the end, it should look like that. Next up, we're going to start putting some of these resistors on. These are the 10K resistors marked 103. So the way you get these resistors on is you just tin one of the pads and then slide the resistor into place so it's centered between the 2 pads, and then solder the other side so that you get a nice little tent and a little bit underneath, but not bridging underneath the chip. And then touch up the other side so you have a nice shiny tent on that side as well. Now we're going to do the capacitors. 0.1 UF capacitors here. This is the white paper carrier. Again, don't mess these up. They look exactly the same. And so these 2 go right in those spots marked C104. But they go in exactly the same way as the resistor chip there, the 10K that we just put in. You just tin one of the pads and slide them into place. Now, I just want to reemphasize again, make sure you're using the right capacitors here, because these brown capacitors look exactly the same, the 10 UF and the 0.1 UF. These are the 0.1 UF in the paper carrier. But once you get them tinned in, they solder in exactly the same as the resistors. All the others, just like the other surface mounted parts here, you turn your. This is another reason I like the Panavice, right? Because you can turn it around very easily. You don't have to take the board out. You just move your device around and orient the way it's easiest for you to solder. But solder to both sides securely in. Same deal, a little bit under the chip onto the pad, and a nice little shiny tint over the chip itself. Next up, we've got this MOSFET, this little teeny MOSFET. It's 3 pins in a little triangle pattern there, and it goes right over by that capacitor. Same deal here. You just tin one of the pads. I like to tin that small pad. Slide it into place. Make sure the whole thing is centered on those 3 pads, and then solder each pin in securely. Very small pins here. I'm still using that very large, kind of large soldering iron here. Worked out pretty well. Next up, we got these 4.7K resistors. Again, they all go in the same way. So I'm going to start speeding up the video here so that you don't have to keep watching surface mounted chips going in exactly the same way. But make sure you've got these in the right place. Tin them in. And then once you've got them all tinned in, solder them in securely with a nice tent of solder. Okay. After we get that done, we're going to put these driver chips in. Now these have a bevel on one side. If you look closely, that bevel has to go. See, I'm pointing it out there. That bevel has to go towards that small square silk screened inside the larger rectangle. That's pin 1, and that's how you have to orient the board. It also, if you look at the lettering, it has to go towards that silk screen square. Sorry, tongue twister there. But just you'll notice that the 2 middle pins on the top of the chip are fused together on one pad. So I like to just tin those, and then that gets your chip in place very securely. But heat up that tinned pad and then make sure that they're nice and centered on all 8 pins, just like that. Once those are in, go ahead and, just like the processor chip, go ahead and start soldering each pin in securely. Nice shiny little tin of solder up underneath the pin, but not bridging or onto the chip itself. And we're speeding this up a little bit because this is pretty much the same technique now as you've seen before. All right, now that we've got the driver chips in, some more resistors. These are 100K resistors. We're going to put one here over by the driver chips, speeding it up. And now the voltage regulator. The voltage regulator goes right there by the driver chips, and you're just going to tin that very large pad and move the regulator into place. Once it's nice and centered on all 4 pads, you're going to solder everything, each pin in securely. Now, the difference here is you need to wait at least 30 seconds between each pin because you could overheat the chip. So once you have it in place and you're happy with it, I did wait 30 seconds in between each pin, but you don't want to sit here and watch, nothing happening. So once I did each pin, I sped up the video here and cut out that 30-second wait time. But do take the time to wait in between each one so that you don't overheat the chip. Now, once you're finished with the 3 small pins, wait another 30 seconds, and then go ahead and put a pretty decent chunk of solder here on that large pin. It not only does it give you a good connection, you got a lot of voltage going through here, but it acts as a heat sink. Now we've got some a 1K resistor. That's the only one on the board that goes up there by the voltage regulator. Goes in the same as all the other resistors. And then we have a 22K resistor going right next to it. Same technique. Tin it and secure it. There we go. Here is another 100K resistor going in on the other side of the board. Notice we flipped the board over now. We're working on the top side of the board. Next up, we've got these 10 UF capacitors. Again, make sure you're using the right ones here. They're very distinctive because they're in a plastic carrier, and they are actually a little bit larger, but they look very much the same. But they go, both of them go right there by that 100K resistor, and they go in exactly the same way. So go ahead and put those in, tack them in, and solder them in securely. Okay, now we are going to put another of these 100K resistors right above the 10 UF capacitors. And once that's in, we're good there. Now we've got the last 0.1 UF capacitor going in right next to that 100K resistor we just put in. And now we've got this rectifier. It's got a very large pad. So tin that large pad and get, not a huge amount of solder, but you want to at least spread some solder around there, because you're going to take that and then secure that while it's all still hot. Secure that while keeping it hot. Try to center everything and make sure both of the back pins are at least centered on the pads as best you can. Once you're done with that, just as we've done in the past with these other, the voltage regulator, for instance, solder those two small pins in, and then go back and put a nice coat of solder on top of that large pin. And now that we're done with that, we're going to do the Wi-Fi module. For the Wi-Fi module, I like to use the silicon mat. You're going to take the module and the through-hole resistors that come with the kit, and functionally you're going to put the resistor wires in the holes and solder them in as pins. So just lay it out, and then what I like to do is then tape the module right to the silicon mat that I use. And this is a silicon mat that's specifically designed for soldering. I'll put a link down in the description here. And the nice thing about using this mat is you can just put the wire right into the mat. It's kind of self-healing when you pull it back out, but it sticks there nicely and it holds it in place vertically while you're trying to solder it. So I stick the first pin in through the hole and into the mat, and then I do the opposite corner with another resistor wire and solder that one in. Now functionally your Wi-Fi module is stuck to the mat. It's not going to go anywhere. You could take the tape off if you wanted to. And then just use your clippers to trim the wires about halfway down from the resistor itself, because you're going to need to do this all the way around all of the holes. So from here on out, I'll do one more in kind of real time, but just go to each successive hole, push the wire through the hole into the mat, solder it in place, and then trim it. And then we'll speed up the video here because it's pretty much the same all the way around now. But each time you do this, you want to cut the wire off about halfway, give or take, up to the resistor itself. It's really, you've got plenty of wire here. At the end, when you go to actually put this on the board, you'll find that the long wires themselves, you've got plenty to deal with. So it's not imperative that you get it exactly halfway or the same. We'll even everything out and straighten out the wires afterwards. But for now, just go around and put each wire in each hole, solder them in. You don't need a lot of solder either. At this point, you're just basically tacking in the wire. Later on, we will solder up the top of the Wi-Fi module a little bit more to make sure you have a good connection. Right now, you're just trying to get the wire to stay in place vertically. And so as you get to the end here, you're going to get to the last couple wires in. Then you're going to take the tape off and pry the module out from the mat itself. And then I find that the easiest way to straighten everything out is to take just your flat tweezers and kind of align everything perpendicular to the module itself. So kind of do it lengthwise along the module, and then go back and look at each individual pin, and you'll see that it looks pretty ugly at the beginning, but within a minute or so you can align everything properly and have fairly straight pins. And then once you get them all aligned, relatively speaking, we'll make sure we'll kind of get them in place when we go to put them onto the board itself. But then take your clippers and then just even everything out. You don't have to, once again, it doesn't have to be perfect at this point. The main intent is to just make it easier to get it into the mounting holes on the board. Do be careful when you do this. I like to put my finger over the ends of the wires because it does have a tendency to spit out little chunks of wire there that can get all over the place or get in your eyes. So just be careful when you're trimming off the ends of these wires, and control the pieces that are flying off. And that's so that at this portion, that's it. Just once again, take a look at the wires. Make sure they're straight. Don't worry about the top right now because that's pretty irrelevant at this point. We'll trim all of those off later on. Okay, with the Wi-Fi pins all nice and straight and even, we're going to place the Wi-Fi module onto the board, and you have to align all those pins into the holes on the board. I found the easiest way to do that is you just kind of hold the module in place and then use a pair of tweezers to just kind of align each individual pin until the chip just falls neatly into the onto the board. There you go. And the more you even out the pins before you try this, the easier it is. But when you're done, when you put it on, you should have about 1/8 of an inch, maybe 1/16 of an inch between the board and the module. It can't just sit flush. It has to have a little bit of space. If you find that your module is sitting flush straight to the board, go ahead and put like a little index, piece of index card or something like 3x5 card in between there, and you'll be fine. But tape the module down securely so it doesn't go anywhere, and then start going around and soldering each one of the pins with a nice tent of solder, that goes down in the hole. It's very secure. It's nice and shiny. You'll notice the pins move around a little bit. That's okay. While the solder's hot, just make sure it's straight when you're done, and then do all of the pins on this side of the board all the way around. Once you have the pins soldered in, we're going to go and trim the each pin. Now, go ahead and use some kind of tweezers or pliers, whatever you're going to use to control that cutoff piece, because they do go flying, and it's a safety hazard. I do recommend you wear eye protection while you're doing this, but you have to make sure you account for each one of those, because they could get on the board, they could get under the Wi-Fi module or one of the other components and short something out. So make sure you control the piece that's flying off, the cutoff piece, and also do something with it, positive control of it, so you know where it is and you don't lose any of these. But we're going to speed this up here and go ahead and go back to the top. Now just touch up the solder on these top pins. This is the part where I see the most problems with these builds. When people have an issue, I almost always see one of these pins wasn't quite soldered correctly, securely. So you have to make sure that you go back. I like to just touch them up. Make sure you have a nice solid connection to the Wi-Fi module itself. But then when you're done, same thing, go around and cut off all the pieces. Here's a pro tip. All those pieces you got on your work mat now, you want to get rid of them, just take a piece of tape and grab them all up, and then you can just throw them away easily. Okay, with the Wi-Fi module on, we've got a few more things to do on the board. Now we want to put these 100K resistors in on the bottom, and same technique. There we go. All right, so we've got our resistors done there. Now it's the buzzer. Now notice that the buzzer is polarized. It has a positive and the one side, and the positive side is a longer pin. That pin goes into the plus sign on the board. You just drop the buzzer in and tape it down and go ahead and solder the other side. These are just like all of the other 3-hole pins you've been working on here. Solder them in securely, nice little tent, and then trim off at least the long one. it needs to be trimmed. Okay, with the buzzer in, the next thing up is going to be this MOSFET. So notice that metal backing on the back. That goes on that thick line silkscreen on the board. So make sure you've oriented it properly, but it's pretty simple. You just drop it in there, make sure it's seated properly, tape it down, turn the board over, and solder each one of these pins in with a nice tent. Now it's a pretty big pad. Just make sure you've got good solder flow all the way across the pad and onto the pin itself. All right, once you get those pins securely soldered in, go ahead and trim off your excess wires and control those. Okay, with the FET in, the next thing up, terminal block. Now make sure those larger holes are pointed to the outside of the board. It won't hurt anything if you do it the other way, but it's a lot harder to connect your wiring in if the wires are pointed to the inside of the board. So just drop it into the holes there, tape it down, and simple through hole pins that you need to solder. All right, once this terminal block is soldered in place, the next thing we're going to do is put our headers in. There's an angle header here, and it's 4 angled headers. You need to clip one off. Just use a pair of wire cutters or whatever, and clip one of the one off so you have a single and a 3. Now put the 3 in, and the short pins obviously go down, and the bended part goes over the Wi-Fi chip. Tape those down. Put the tape right through the pins, or I'm sorry, the pins right through the tape. Makes it easy to just tape the header right to the board, and then turn it over and solder the through-hole pins securely. Now, once you have those 3 pins soldered in, you're going to turn the board back over, and you need to put in this single pin on the 3 volt hole there by the buzzer. Well, you don't have to, but I like to, because I sometimes like to use the telemetry module with this board. I like to angle it just slightly away from the buzzer there, because you're going to have to put a connector on there if you do use it, and it's certainly a lot easier than trying to shove it in very close to the buzzer. If you just give it just a slight angle away, makes your life easier later on if you do use the pin. All right, we need to connect a battery to this. I'm going to use a JST connector. You can use whatever kind of connector you're going to use with your batteries, but since I'm using 2S LiPos that have JST connectors, that's what I'm going to use. Make sure your polarity is correct, and we're going to solder them right to where it says the battery there, BAT. And in this case, I have checked my polarity. The red wire is positive and the black wire is negative. So just get them in. I like them coming out to the top of the board. You can have it any way you want. But once I get the wire in place, I just use a pair of helping hands to hold it and solder those wires in securely. And then if you notice there was looked a little like a cold solder, and just heat it up a little bit, gets down in that hole. But do the same thing with the positive wire here, helping hands, get a nice little tent. Now we need to bridge this. If you're only going to use single batteries, now this board is really cool. It can use dual batteries. I'm going to configure this for a single battery option. And to do that, you're going to need some sort of bridge wire. This is just off a resistor that I had used at some other time. Just use, in my case, the tweezers work perfectly here. They're perfectly spaced. Just give it a nice U-shaped bend and drop it right into the hole from the B plus and the DP plus. Now, if you're going to use 2 batteries, it's a completely different configuration, but we're going to configure this for single. So tape that bridge wire in, and I don't usually use 2 batteries with the Quantums. I use 2 batteries a lot with protons because I use protons for air starts. But I don't usually see a good need for 2 batteries on the Quantum. But it's an awesome capability that it does have. But this is what the board looks like when it's done. We have soldered all the components on, and this is what your board should look like when you're finished, with a single battery configuration, not a dual battery. So now we're going to test everything. So the first thing we're going to do is a power on test, just to make sure that it works. So when we plug this in, we should get a series of beeps. All right, those beeps tell us that we did the build correctly up to this point. Now we still have to check the Wi-Fi and make sure it all connects. In order to do that, keep the board powered on, and then connect it to whatever device. Your phone's the best thing to use, but you go to on your browser, once you've connected it to the Wi-Fi on the board and use the code, go to that browser page there, 192.168.4.1. And you can see that we're connected. So that's a good sign. The Wi-Fi is working and we're all set. Now I like to just connect a couple of these incandescent Christmas lights. These are great for testing to make sure everything's working properly in your deployment channels. You can see now that the drogue status and the main status is on because it has something connected to it. If you go to the test page, which is the same page as before, but with the /test, you can test each channel by choosing it in the channel test select dropdown and then putting in the code for that and then hitting the test. Now that'll give you a countdown, and if you did everything right, it should give you a light using the Christmas lights. There we go. The drogue channel works. We'll do the same thing with the main channel just to make sure that works. And similarly as the drogue, you pull the main, choose main from the pull down, put in your code, and then let it go for its countdown. And if we did everything right, we should get one of the Christmas lights lighting up. All right, and the main works. Probably the last thing is I do like to take a Sharpie and write that Wi-Fi code right on the Wi-Fi module. Yeah, it's in your phone and everything, but it's really nice to have it written on there so that if you're at the field and you forget what it is, you can always open up your eBay and take a look at it and reconnect. And also, you don't forget, you can get that code if you go into, you connect it to a computer. But it's a lot easier if you just have it written on the chip. So this is done. Everything worked out really well in this build. Hopefully this works for you. This is an amazing flight computer. If you have any questions or comments about this build, please leave them down in the comments. And good luck.